Hello everyone, welcome. Dr. Mark L. Teague here with The Working Man's Guide. I'm glad you've joined me. You know, I had the opportunity recently to do a tour in the prisons of Oregon. I have a good friend, cousin, that he and his wife, Dale and Sandy Russell, have spent a good 18 years building a ministry, a service, an outreach in the Oregon prison system. And on the basis of our book, A Working Man's Guide, Dale asked me to put together a presentation and go on tour with him and go around the prison system. We did that. We went to 5 different facilities, had 8 different meetings. We spoke to just almost 300 inmates and just had a grand time. The receptiveness there was striking to me. The engagement, it was just amazing. It did as much for me, certainly, as it did for the inmates. I want to share that with you today, share that message and take you through it and make a recording so they can use it within the prison system and reach an even broader audience. So let's go to the title side. You can see it there. Visions of Hope is the supporting ministry that we went with, the organization. We call this the Romans 120 tour, Evidence and Choice, a Faith for the Ages. I want to share that with you today. We're going to talk bedrock, foundation, things you can build your life on, things you can believe and place your trust in. Let's look at that phrase, a faith for the ages. You know, this faith as a follower of Christ, and I am that. I'm a devoted follower of our Savior, Jesus Christ. As that, this faith that he gives us and that we walk in, it is not tenuous. It's not timid. It's not subject to recall. It's not fragile. It's not dependent upon time or circumstance or people or culture. It is a people for all times. It is a faith for all times, for all places, for all conditions, for all people. It is a faith for the ages. Now, a critic would look at that and say, that's impossible. So we can date the thought line that you espouse. We can date that through Abraham and written down by Moses, and we can trace that line of thinking. It goes to Abraham, moved to the Levant, and he had a people there that were very close-knit and took care of their own. And then along came a man named Jesus Christ that took a branch of that thinking, and that made its way across Europe and then to the United States. That's what a critic would say. They would say you can't declare that as a faith for the ages. It depends on where you grew up. It depends on what you were taught. Circumstances matter. Culture matters. Well, let's take a hard look at that. I want to look at that very idea. In fact, I want to introduce you to one of my favorite people groups, the oldest people group that we know anything about, called the Denisovans. And let me take you locationally to where they were first discovered. This is in 2008 when the discovery was made. You go to China, everyone knows where that is, a large country on the Pacific coast. Go northwest of that to Mongolia, another large nation. Go northwest of that even further. And for another marker, Lake Baikal. Everyone knows where that is. Very large lake by volume, the largest freshwater body on the planet. Go west and a little south of there. You're squarely in south central Siberia, a place called the Altai Mountains. There's a cave there, the Denisova Cave. There were remains found there in 2008. They became known as the Denisovan people. Now, let's just ask the question, what could my faith that I stand here and espouse now have anything to do with them? How could it possibly tie to that people group? They're halfway around the world, entirely different millennia. They're a Stone Age people. We're here in modern, I'm standing here in Abilene, Texas in 2025. How could I talk about a faith that relates to them in any way whatsoever? A critic would say nothing. Your faith is very much due to lineage that's been handed down to you. Let's break it down. Let's see how that works. Let's start with the core of the definition of faith within the realm of Christianity. As a follower of Christ, let's define it there and then we will proceed from there. I'm going to read from Scripture, and I will be reading from the New American Standard Bible, NASB, version 1995. If your Bible's a little different, you'll have a little different translation. That's just fine. There are a lot of good ones. That's my personal favorite. That's the one I read from. So let's start in Ephesians chapter 2. I'll be reading here, verses 8 through 10. Now, what we're about to read is a core idea within Christianity. Now, within the Christian faith, there are a number of things we can agree to disagree on. They're not central. There are some things we cannot agree to disagree on. And this is one of those things. There are many verses that embed this idea and teach this idea, this doctrine of salvation. This is a core one. This, in fact, if you just know one verse about salvation as it regards to a follower of Christ, this is a good one to know right here. Let's read it. Ephesians chapter 2, verse 8. For by grace you have been saved through faith, and that not of yourselves. It is the gift of God, not as a result of works, that no one should boast. Now, let's stop a minute. The author of this is the Apostle Paul. And he was a master linguist, just a genius in the use of language to convey thoughts and ideas and do it with great accuracy, great clarity. His words are very sound. Let's look at the grammar that he uses here. Let's start again. For by grace you have been saved through faith. He offers that as a phrase, a complete phrase. For by grace you have been saved through faith. A new phrase, and that not of yourselves. It is the gift of God. Now, when he says in that, he's referring to what piece? He's referring to that entire first phrase. There are three components in that phrase. For by grace, you have been saved through faith. He mentions explicitly three things there: grace, faith, and salvation. That entire package, that entire process of being saved by grace through faith, that whole thing, it's not of ourselves. It is the gift of God. It is not as a result of works, that no one should boast. Now let me add verse 10 to that. For we are his workmanship, created in Christ Jesus for good works, which God prepared beforehand that we should walk in them. Now I want to paint a picture for you that is supported by this verse. Picture yourself standing here at the edge of a chasm. You're standing there. It's an impossible, impassable gap. And across there, you can see right on the other side of that chasm is grace, faith, and salvation. Everything that I need those things. I need faith in this life. I need grace, and I need salvation. But it's across this chasm. I can't touch it. I can't reach it. It's not mine. It doesn't belong to me. I can't buy it. I can't produce it. It is separated from me. So how do I get there? How do I get to it? God says, here, I give it to you. It's a gift. All of that entire package, the grace, the faith, and the salvation are a gift from God. It is not as a result of works, that no one should boast. It is not of us. We need it, but we can't get it, and we don't produce it. It's not ours to make. It's not ours to buy. God gives it to you as a gift. Okay, now that is the idea of faith and the role of faith in the Christian walk. I'm standing here with an impossible gap between me and what I need. I need faith. I need grace. I need salvation. God gives it to you. He just says, believe. Exercise the faith that I gave you. That takes you to the grace that saves you. God created that entire process for us, and he gives it to you. He just expects you to believe. Now, he adds on verse 10. Let me add that in. For we are his workmanship, created in Christ Jesus for good works. Okay, it is a faithful statement in the Christian walk, the Christian faith. We are not saved by good works. We are saved for good works. That's why God saves us. He gives us the faith, the grace, and the salvation. And once we believe, we walk in that, he says, come on, I have things for you to do. I want you to take the talents that I give you, the opportunities. I want you to do good things with that. That's why I saved you. So now you can do good things. So we're not saved by good works. We are saved for good works. That's the role of faith within this Christian walk as we follow Christ. Now, let's go back to our original question. What about the Denisovans? What does this have to do with them? You know, the critic does have a point in that we know when these scriptures were written. We have the dates. We can peg it. The book of Job is about the only one that's a little bit open, but we have a rough idea of when that was written. Very likely written by Moses, somewhere in the 1500 BC range. We know that there were many people groups, entire civilizations, that lived and died before a single word of this Bible was written. So we need to account for that as believers. We hold to these scriptures. This book that we're reading from, we hold this to be the infallible, inerrant Word of God. And indeed it is that. It's also true that before a word of this was put down, many people lived and died, entire civilizations came and went without a single word of this being available to them. So I'm going to use my Denisovans as our example. What about them? This passage we read in Ephesians is very powerful, very clear. It gives clear guidance to us as to how to exercise faith and its role. Well, what about them? They never read that. They never saw that. How does it apply to them? Well, let's break this down. First, we need to do a couple of things. I need to explode a myth around faith. There's a myth that's very common in both believers and unbelievers, people that walk in faith and people that don't. The notion is that faith is inherently tied to a sentiment, a feeling. If I feel a certain way, then God is close to me. If I don't feel a certain way, then God is distant. He's not close. I'm not walking with him. Well, it's understandable how that has come about because certain experiences, many experiences of faith involve a great deal of sentiment. You know, when we practice the Christian habits and the disciplines such as prayer, worship, fellowship, sharing our faith, when we open the scriptures and we read and study, those things can involve tremendous sentiment and emotion. God can give us his visceral, tangible presence in such a way, it can put us on our knees. It can put us on our face. And so sentiment can play a large role in the walk of faith. But here's the myth, that is the core, the center of faith. It is not. I want to show you the very core, the very center of faith, what it consists of. So let's break that down. First of all, let's dispel with that myth. Now I want to show you what it is. Let's check it out. Let me introduce a couple of phrases to you, then I'm going to break these down. Faith is a rational response to a rational question. Rationality leads you to faith. It leads you straight to it. And then we have a choice to make. If faith is a rational response to a rational question. Let's see how that works. Now let's look elsewhere in scriptures. I want to go to Romans chapter 1, verse 20. We'll read that. There exists a twin pillar of witness, a twin column of testimony that has been available through all the ages since the beginning of time. I want to show you how it works. Let's start here. The first column of witness, the first column of testimony. For since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood through what has been made, so that they meaning us. At this point, Paul is separating Jews and Gentiles. When he says they, he means all of us, Gentiles, so that they are without excuse. Now, let's look at how that works. We're looking at this first pillar of testimony. Now, this next slide I'm going to take you to, I want all of you to brace yourself. This can be quite sentimental, quite emotional. Don't get carried away. Bear with me. Here we go. Hold on tight. Can you feel it? Doesn't that just overwhelm you with emotion? I know most all of you know what this is, the periodic table of elements. You know, obviously I'm joking with you. There's nothing less emotional than what we're looking at now, the table of elements. This is pure science, pure rationality. There is no sentiment tied to this whatsoever. This is hard fact, hard science. Now, I want to show you how this works. Remember our phrases. Rationality leads you to faith. Faith is a rational response to a rational question. Now, let's break this down. This is a very important, fundamental, foundational part of science. Let's look at the history of this table. First of all, let's define what it is. So look at that top center example. Chlorine is highlighted there right in the middle. In the upper left-hand corner is the atomic number. That's the number of protons within an atom. So right at the center of it, in the nucleus of an atom, you have neutrons and protons. That number means there are 17 protons in that atom. Okay, in the upper right, you have the atomic mass. That's the weight. That's the protons plus the neutrons, the weight of the nucleus. Now, electrons are involved as well, but they have very little mass. They're an electronic charge. They circle the nucleus of the atom. So that upper right-hand number is a combination of neutrons and protons. We have 17 protons. And then that number, the atomic mass, is the weighted average over the different isotopes. Different isotopes meaning there can be different numbers of neutrons. So we have 17 protons. We can have 18, 19, or 20 neutrons within the element of chlorine. Okay, but if you look at the relative volume of those, it's mostly isotope 18. That's the highest weight. So you see the 35.45. And some of those are radioactive. Isotope 36 of chlorine is radioactive. We use that to date and age bodies of water. So if you find a hidden body of water that's down deep in the earth that's never been touched, if scientists can get a sample of that, they'll look at the chlorine 36 isotope, and you can get a good idea of the age. So it's a very powerful idea. And then, of course, you see the atomic symbol, the element symbol, and then the name, and then the grouping. And you also see the columns in the rows mean something. So across row 1, you have hydrogen and helium. Across row 2, lithium, beryllium, etc. Row 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. There are 7 rows. Those rows indicate common attributes regarding the electromagnetic charge of that atom. And the columns are the same thing. There are commonalities across those 18 columns regarding the shape of that charge, the path of the electron around that atomic nucleus. Okay, so, and then you can see the bottom 2 rows, those are actually associated with rows 6 and 7. That's done by a color scheme there. We must have a chemist somewhere with an active left and right brain. They got pretty creative with their scheme. They're using they're displaying 3 and 4 dimensions in a 2-dimensional flat layout. It's pretty clever. Now, when I was a young man, 103 was where it ended, at Lawrencium. We now have up to a 118, and I understand through reading that elements 119 and 120 are soon to be released and finalized. But that entire row of 104 to 118, those are synthetic. They have been created in a laboratory. You see, once you understand the structure of this table, well, then you can manipulate it. You can use it. We can work against it. And that's been happening. Livermore Labs and other places put a lot of time into that. Well, you can see the elegance and the massive amount of information that's in this table, purely rational. There's no sentiment tied to that. Hard fact, hard science. Now let's look a little at the history. This was first published by Dmitry Mendeleev, a Russian scientist, in 1869. About a century before that, individuals by the name of Lavoisier, Dobereiner, Newlands, since about 1769, they worked very hard on this. Mendeleev first published it. He published 60 elements, and he left gaps in his table. He said, you're going to find elements here, here, and here, and he was exactly right. That has happened since then. So you can see the elegance, the order, and the structure of this table. It's amazing. And you know, science is very active now on the table that is behind this one, subatomic particles. There's a table that this one rests upon that we know about now. Tremendous research being done there. And you know, it's just as orderly and structured as this one. The standard model of particle physics is well developed, well underway, still a lot to be learned there. But the colliders, the scientific labs that circle the atoms around and run them into each other, they help us understand a great deal about not only atoms and elements, but the structure behind it. So you have 4 laws of particle physics. We directly observe 3. The 4th one is not hasn't been seen yet, but it's inferred. We know that it exists. There are over 200 subatomic particles that we know something about now. Leptons, muons, bosons, fermions, neutrinos, the Higgs boson particle. I know many of you have seen that in the news. Well, that is active and very intense research. We're learning a lot there. That's a table behind the table of elements. So let's go back to our phrase and remember our Denisovans. How could faith have anything to do with them? Let's go back to my phrases. Faith is a rational response to a rational question. Rationality, facts, lead you to faith. Let's go back to Romans 1:20. Let's read it again. For since the creation of the world, since the very beginning of time, including all peoples, all cultures, all circumstances, all conditions, since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood through what has been made, so that we are without excuse. Let's look at this again. You see this, and I choose this as an example, but all of science falls in this same category. Look at this table and look at what you see. You see complexity. This is not simple. It's complex. And it is marked by order, structure, function, purpose, in a word, design. Now, rationality leads you to faith. How so? This table leads you to a simple question. Where did that come from? Who made that? What's the source? You're faced with that question. These facts, these rational scientific facts, take you straight up to that question. Where did that come from? What's the source? And you only have 2 answers. There are only 2 ways to answer that question. It's a random accident. It just happened to pop up, happened to be there, or it's designed. It's made. Therefore, there is a designer. Now, notice this table, the periodic table of elements, it doesn't force anyone to believe. You are not forced to conclude that God exists by looking at that, but you are faced with the question, where did that come from? How did that come to be? Is it random? Is it blind? Or is it designed? Is it made? Now here's some hard facts you need to reconcile with. Science is not a cause. Science is a tool. Science creates nothing. So we use science to uncover, to understand, to break apart, to break down. And then we can use it to manipulate and to design, to make use of. But all the base materials, all the things that we work with, all the basic laws, they're already there. We're just discovering them. Mendeleev published this in 1869. It was already there. So let's look at the elements. You guys remember the pop band in the 70s, Earth, Wind, and Fire. And they were fun. That's a play off Aristotle's claims. Aristotle spoke at length about the 4 basic elements, earth, wind, water, and fire. He was pointing in the right direction. He was way off in terms of content, but I want to point out to you just how close he actually got. Remember, this is in 450 BC. He would notice that certain things were more fundamental than others. He would look at fire, and he noticed that it reduced everything to a common component. Once fire was done, Everything kind of looked the same except the other components like earth, wind, and water. Those would not be affected. So these four elements that he's noticed tended to be independent. But fire would reduce things to a common component. We would call it ash. Look at element number 6 there, carbon. That's what he was looking at. Wind, air in motion, element number 8, oxygen. Yeah, he was that close. And the what he would call earth was a combination of stone and dirt and those things. It's a combination of several of these elements in this table make what we would call stone and earth. Water, take 2 of these elements. Take H, hydrogen, and 2 of oxygen, H2O, water. Now, I want you to look at the structure of this. We have the subatomic particles, stands as a base, and I'm sure there's something under that. We'll discover it one of these days. Subatomic particles take us to atoms, elements. Then you go to molecules. Then you go to compound molecules. Then you go to materials and things that we work with. Ladies and gentlemen, when you look at this table of periodic table of elements, you are looking at the fabric of the universe. Everything that you taste, touch, see, smell, or hear is tied to this table. I want to take you back. Romans 1:20. For since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood through what has been made, so that they, us, are without excuse. Ladies and gentlemen, rationality leads you to faith. In this physical world, you cannot escape this table. It's everywhere. It's everything that you handle, everything that you do is tied to this table. Where did that come from? Give me an honest answer to this question. Is that an accident? Just look at that table. Is that random? That just happened to pop up? Just happened to appear? You know, I don't mean to brag, but I'm somewhat of an expert on accidents. I've been involved in quite a few of them. I've observed many more. I know a lot about accidents. They never look like this. Not even close. Nothing related to this. Ladies and gentlemen, I would say with every fiber of my being, that table, it's made. It's designed. It has all the hallmark traits, all the attributes. Now, you are not forced to believe. Remember, science is not a cause. Science is a tool. Remember this as well. Science belongs to the universe, not the other way around. The universe does not belong to science. We don't have a universe because of science. We have science because we have a universe. Because the universe is rational and orderly, we can then develop science, a set of robust tools in order to explore and understand the world and the universe in which we live. That's the proper order. Now, with those facts being understood, you need to understand when it comes to hypothesis testing, the scientific approach to showing something to be true or not, the question of God is that's outside the realm of science. When you ask about God and first cause, that is outside the realm of the universe. God is the first cause of the universe. Therefore, science does not apply to that. But you know what does apply? Euclidean logic. That applies directly. So there's never going to be a scientific test that says, does God exist or does God not exist? You know, you're not going to go down to the mall, a Friday meeting, 2:30, and have coffee with the Almighty and meeting and say, hey, I'm going to meet with him. I have a few questions. We're talking about a spiritual being that transcends time and space. You're not going to walk down the street and shake his hand. It doesn't work that way. But we see evidence of his existence. This table is a very powerful one. And you can look at any element of science that you want. You're going to see the same thing, the same attributes of this table. Complex, marked by order, structure, purpose, function. That to me screams design. Now, I may be a simple man to many of you, but when I look at that, there's no way I can say that's a random accident. And I can tell you this, I'm not about to bet my eternal destination on that being an accident. Those are bad odds. That's a bad bet. If you go to Vegas on those odds, you're coming home flat busted every time. You have no chance. That's just bad odds. That takes us to Pascal's wager. Even if God doesn't exist, you're better off acting as though he does because of the weight of probability in favor of him existing, and the consequences thereof are very serious. Plus, you get a better life. The stats are clear. When you live a life of faith and you accept those principles and attributes, you have better outcomes in this life. So the evidence is quite clear. But look back at that table again, the periodic table of elements. Rationality leads you to faith. It stands you right up in front of the question, where did that come from? Everyone faces it, everyone looks at it, and everyone makes a choice. You are not forced to believe or not to believe. That is human agency. Human agency says, I make the final choice for me. And that's the way it works. This is information. It brings you right to the question, where did that come from? You have two answers. It's either a random accident or it is made. Therefore, there's a maker. I can say this, I bow my knee to the maker. I bow my knee to the one that made that chart, that created the information that we have discovered to create that chart. I trust him. I walk after him. Okay? So faith is actually the very core, the very heart of faith. It is a rational response to a rational question. There needs be no sentiment whatsoever. None. That's not at the core, the very heart, the center of faith. Now, a ton of emotion and sentiment can be associated with the things of faith as you walk out your faith. They often are. God blesses us that way in many different ways. I encourage you to enjoy that when you worship, when you pray, when you fellowship, when you study the scriptures. Enjoy the sentiment that comes with that. It's fantastic. That is his visceral, tangible presence. I don't need that as a basis for my faith. I look at this world around me and I say, that's not an accident. It's made. Now, he didn't just leave us with one column of witness. He gave us two. Let's read the second one. In Romans chapter 2, verses 14 through 16. Remember, there's a twin column of witness and testimony. For when the Gentiles who do not have the law do instinctively the things of the law, meaning the Mosaic law of the Jewish people, these, not having the law, are a law to themselves, in that they show the work of the law written in their hearts, their conscience bearing witness, and their thoughts alternately accusing or else defending them. On the day when, according to my gospel, God will judge the secrets of men through Christ Jesus. So let's look at that verse 15 again. In that they show the work of the law written in their hearts, their conscience bearing witness, and their thoughts alternately accusing or else defending them. So we have pillar one, all of physical creation, all of the scientific, hard, rational facts lead you to the question, where does that come from? On top of that, we have a second pillar, a second column, the human soul, the human heart. Ladies and gentlemen, there is within us a moral calculator. Moral consideration happens inside of us. How many of you out there like to be lied to? Anybody? You know, it was interesting in the Oregon prisons. I stood in front of that almost 300 inmates. I asked this question every time. No takers. In fact, they are adamant. They hated it. I said, how many of you like to be harmed? No takers. How many of you like to be stolen from? Nobody. No takers. I said, well, you know, what's the next thought after that? If I don't like to be lied to, maybe I shouldn't lie to the other guy. Maybe I shouldn't lie to him. There's a moral law within us. We understand right from wrong. There is a commonality. Now let's go back to our Denisovan. My favorite people group, the Denisovans. What about them? What did they have in front of them? You know, that Denisovan, he's going to walk out of his cave at night. He's going to look up at that night sky, and he will often see those northern lights flickering across the heavens. And he's going to notice on any given night that everything moves in a circular pattern except this one star. He knows nothing about Polaris, but he knows that one star on a given night, it's fixed. And over the course of the seasons, he'll see that one star change locations. And that would be a year, the solar calendar year. Well, he's going to look at that, and what's that going to do? If he cares to pay attention, it brings the question to him, where did that come from? Is that random or is it made? He has the same question in front of him that I have in front of me. By the same token, that Denisovan, he's standing in his cave in that other tribe across the valley there. He's thinking, if you guys harm my family, I'm going to take care of you in sure fashion. Well, the thought should occur to him, and I'm certain it did. If I don't want him to harm my family, I shouldn't harm his. That is reciprocal. The law of the conscience, the law of the heart. Now you have the same question. That moral code that rests within us, where did that come from? What's the source? You have the same two options. Random, just happen to pop up, just some neurological accident that produced that, or it's made, it's designed. Now I would say, if you look at the same thing with the heart as with physical creation, you see complexity marked by order, function, purpose, design, structure. That screams it was made. I accept that, and I accept the one that made it. You're free to reject that. But here's the thing the atheist has to face up to. So for you atheists out there committed to your course that the world is a big, random, blind accident, I have a couple of questions for you, very simple questions. If the universe is blind and random, then wouldn't it be blind and random? It isn't. It is infused. It is super infused with intelligence. How did that start? With no template, with no pattern, with no prior a priori information infused into that system. In a blind, random system, you get the mass complexity that we see marked by order and structure. You know, I have to be intellectually honest, I have to say to the atheist, there is a chance that's true. The universe could be an accident, but boy, it is one heck of an accident if that's the case. That is a very ungenerous view. If you take that view, there is an alternative available, ladies and gentlemen. It's not an accident. It's made. It's designed. Now, another word, a question and a comment to my atheist friends, and I've known many of you over the years. I've been good friends with several. Here's a pattern of thinking you're going to have to stick to. If you're going to say there is no God, which you're free to do, you can make that choice. There's no God. There is no maker. Therefore, the universe is a blind, random accident. We only have the physical aspect of it to work with. Therefore, those things are true. There is no meaning, no purpose whatsoever. None. Those things are factual. You have to stop right there. Now, all the atheists I've known, and I hear them frequently these days, especially in the press, they then go forward and say, well, I find meaning and purpose in doing this, that, and the other. Oh, no. No, you got to stop right there. For the atheist view, there is no God. The universe is blind and random. There is no meaning, no purpose. You stop right there. You have nothing else to add. There is no credence to any moral law over another. None. One is not better than the other. It's just simply the power to put it into place. And that's it. Nothing else. You cannot appeal to a higher power when you just said there is none. There is no higher power. Okay? Well, you have to stop at you cannot assert that there's any meaning and purpose whatsoever, because if you do, if you say there's meaning and purpose, you just acknowledged that meaning and purpose exist. Here's something to consider. Those intangible things in life. Let's take love as an example. If you take an act of love, did you create love? No. You choose to walk in it. You choose to participate in it. You see, the existential aspect of our human nature is limited to choosing to participate in what is already present. We don't create love. We don't create hope. We don't create joy, altruism, nobility, courage. All of those, that vast, deep reservoir of good things that the human heart needs, they're already there. They predate us. They were there before we got here. They will be there after we're gone. Meaning and purpose are already there. We are choosing to walk in them. So you have the same question. How did that get here? Is that a random accident? I say that's impossible. There's no way that's a random accident. The atheist says it is a random accident and you're free to do so, but you need to stop at the fact that if it's blind and random, none of that exists. End of discussion right there. That's as far as you can go. Okay, so let's press a little deeper. We have these two pillars of witness. They apply to every human that has ever walked the face of this earth. That is a tie to not only the Denisovans, the Sumerians, the Manchurians, the Mayans, the Aztecs, the Chaldeans, the Babylonians, you name a culture, that has been in front of all of us. From the beginning of time, those twin pillars of witness, the physical creation and the workings, the internal workings of the human heart. That is a twin column of witness that gives testimony to the nature of our God. I'm going to read Romans 1:20 again. For since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood through what has been made, so that they are without excuse. And then you add to that Romans 2. They show the work of the law written in their hearts, their conscience bearing witness, and their thoughts alternately accusing or else defending them. The moral calculus that happens within all of us. A point here I want to point out, that moral calculus, none of us like to be lied to. None of us want to be harmed. None of us want to be stolen from. None of us want to be taken advantage of. None of us want adultery committed against us. What does that sound like? Thou shalt not murder. Thou shalt not steal. Thou shalt not bear false witness. Exodus 20, the 10 Commandments. When God gave those through Moses, he was not giving top-down commandments for us to burden under and try to keep. He was giving us the blueprint of the human soul, the human heart. That's the structure, the makings of the human soul. That's what we need. Those things are eternal. They've been true since the beginning of time. They will always be true. Now let's point out the words of Christ as well. He said, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Now many have pointed out, well, if I do that, I'm assuming they like what I like. Well, you're confusing preference and principle. Christ was discussing principle. He was discussing these matters of the human heart. There are things that are true for all of us and have been true for every human since the beginning of time and will always be true to the end of time. Those things are principle. And then there's preference. You like things a certain way. Well, you can't assume someone else has the same preference. But when it comes to principle, they're true for all of us. That's why the golden rule works. That's what the 10 Commandments are based upon. That twin pillar of witness has applied and been in front of every human since the beginning of time. And that twin pillar of witness takes us to the same place. It's a question. Rationality leads you to faith. Where did these things come from? All of creation and the workings of the human soul. Where did they come from? Now, that is the core of faith. That's the very core of it, the very center of faith. Sentiment gets tacked on top of that. All the beautiful, wonderful things that we enjoy as we walk in faith, that is stacked on top of that bedrock foundation. Faith is a rational choice. I'm looking at the hard reality of the human heart, the hard reality of this physical creation, and I'm saying that's not an accident. It's made. I choose. Okay? Now let's look at the words of Christ one more time. In light of that definition of faith, which is bedrock, foundational, Christ said a couple of things. He said, if you have faith as a child. Now that is curious, isn't it? Think of that Denisovan. You know, he's worked his tail off all day long. He's hunted. He's taken great risks trying to bring provision to his family. He's risked life and limb. He takes his little Tyke, his little 5-6-year-old son out in the night. He's teaching him to guide himself by the stars. He's saying, you look at this one, look at that one. Here's the directions associated with that. He's teaching his little one the ways of survival. Okay, that little one looks up at that sky and just says, I believe. That's not an accident. I believe in the one that made it. The simple, pure, innocent faith of a child. It rests upon that bedrock of the twin pillars of witness. Okay? Now, another statement that Christ made. He said, if you have faith as a mustard seed. A mustard seed is very small. It's not imposing, but it has in it the elements of life. It is a kernel of life. If you plant it, it grows into a sizable plant and does great good. Gives great shade, has great produce. Mustard has enhanced the diet of mankind for millennia. That faith, that's the power of the faith that we just described. It's as a mustard seed. It's very small, unassuming. It's very powerful and produces great things. If you plant it within your soul, it grows into great things. Those are the words of Christ. So that's what we stand on as our faith. And ladies and gentlemen, I will repeat it. It is a faith for the ages. It is a faith for all times, all peoples, all places, all circumstances, all conditions. It is a faith for the ages. It is a rational response to a rational question. Now, I have a statement I want to make to those of you out there that are believers. Don't you ever doubt your faith ever again, not for 1 second. You go to the shoreline. It's more sure than the surf pounding against that shore. Go to the mountains. It is more sure than the granite embedded in those mountains. Go look at a mighty river. It is more sure and more firm than the course of that river flowing through that valley. You've made a choice. Stand by it. Our faith rests upon all the hard facts that are available to you in this entire universe. They all scream, we're made. We're made. We're designed. We're not an accident. This universe is not an accident. The human soul is not an accident. It is made. It is designed. Your faith rests upon that. Now, I'm going to say this in criticism to the critics, to the atheists. I know you well because I've talked with you often. You guys like to sound smug. An atheist likes to convey the fact that they know something the rest of us don't know. That's not true. Atheist, believer, unbeliever, we all have the exact same information right in front of us. We're just making a different choice. And that's the way it should work. That's the way God designed it. He gives us agency. He gives us freedom of conscience, freedom of will. He grants that to us, but we can never escape the testimony. Now, another thing to look at that twin pillar of witness. Notice the attributes. Now, we've talked about creation, and we looked at the periodic table and things around that. We look at the human soul. Ask yourself this, another simple question. Can you think of anything you do on any given day? Think of yesterday, think of the day before, think of the last month, the last year. Have you done anything that does not involve those two facets of life? Physical creation and the inner workings of the human heart. Anything at all? I can't. It seems to me every single thing we do relates to and involves those two things. The physical creation of this universe and the workings of the human heart. So we could say those twin pillars of witness, they are persistent, they are evident and available across all time periods without fail, and they are pervasive. They are evident in all, available in all circumstance. What does that sound like? The attributes of the Almighty, the one that made them, the God that put those two columns and pillars of witness and testimony in place. They reflect his nature. They reflect his attributes. He is true across all time periods. He is true across all geography. Time and space hide nothing from the Almighty. The twin pillars of witness since the beginning of time have been true, and they will be there to the end of time. Okay, so let's ask another question. Another simple question. I like simple questions. They take you to powerful places. That kind of faith, the faith that we just described, what does it do? What does it act like? How does it behave in this world? Let's take a look at that. Let's move ahead to Luke chapter 23. Let me find it here. Luke chapter 23, I'm going to start reading in verse 54, and I'm going to read through chapter 24, verse 11. Now we're reading, this is very late in the life of Christ. In fact, when we take up the scriptures here, he's just died. He's just been taken off the cross. Nicodemus and Joseph of Arimathea have taken him down. They've taken him to the tomb. And the handful of ladies are there with him. We're going to take up the story there. Luke chapter 23, verse 54. It was the preparation day, and the Sabbath was about to begin. Now the women who had come with him out of Galilee followed after, and saw the tomb and how his body was laid. That's an important detail. They saw how his body was laid. Those of you that have had the privilege to study or go to the Holy Land and see the tombs there, and most likely the tomb that Christ was laid in, you know the structure. There, it's hollowed out in a cliff. You walk into a foyer, and then the tombs are on either one side or both sides of that foyer, depending on if it was one or both. Most likely, the tomb of Christ had two, one on either side. So you walk into a foyer, there's an opening on one side, and then there are two tombs on either side of that. So for this phrase, this detail, they saw how his body was laid. That means they were right there. They were looking right over the shoulder of Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus. They saw how they laid his body in the tomb. That's an important fact. Verse 56, and they returned and prepared spices and perfumes, and on the Sabbath they rested according to the commandment. But on the first day of the week, at early dawn, they came to the tomb, bringing the spices which they had prepared. And they found the stone rolled away from the tomb. And when they had entered, they did not find the body of the Lord Jesus. And it happened that while they were perplexed about this, behold, two men suddenly stood near them in dazzling apparel. And as the women were terrified and bowed their faces to the ground, the men said to them, why do you seek the living one among the dead? He is not here, but he has risen. And I get chills every time I read that. Most very powerful statements in history. Let's finish out here, then we will comment on it. Remember how he spoke to you while he was still in Galilee, saying that the Son of Man must be delivered into the hands of sinful men and be crucified, and the third day rise again. And they remembered his words and returned from the tomb and reported all these things to the 11 and to all the rest. Now they were Mary Magdalene and Joanna and Mary the mother of James, and also the other women with them were telling these things to the apostles. And these words appeared to them as nonsense, and they would not believe them. Now, some important facts here, and then we're going to look at what does this kind of faith do? The faith that we just defined, we just studied, what does it do? Let's look at the life of Christ and see what it does. You know, if we want to understand faith, I would propose, let's look at the one that gave it to us. Let's look at the author and the finisher of our faith. Let's study him and listen to him. Let him tell us how this faith behaves. Now, we're checking in right at the death of Christ and his burial, and then his resurrection. Now, this event changed all of history. Except for the very first verse in the Bible, Genesis 1:1. That's the most important verse of all. In the beginning, God created. Those 5 words change everything. It changes everything about your life. If you accept those 5 words, you will be a very different person than if you reject them. The second most important event after that was this one right here, the resurrection of Christ. A couple things to point out here. Without the resurrection, Christ fades into history and he's a big fat nothing. His opponents, the Pharisees, the scribes, and the Roman rulers, they had a plan to do away with him. They jointly agreed and worked together that this guy cannot be allowed to continue. He is a threat to our order, to our society, to the things that we have created and appreciate. He has to go. And they had a very good plan. The plan of the Jewish leaders, and along with them the Roman leaders, was to destroy his credibility, to brand him as a criminal, to consider him to be a heretic, which in Jewish life was anathema. You were cast out, accursed. It branded him as a heretic, as a loser, basically, without credibility, to terrify his followers and to have the whole thing dissipate. And they got it done. It was a very good plan. And they executed that plan, and they got that very thing accomplished, except one thing, the resurrection. He rose from the dead. Now notice, back to that detail, those ladies that were with him, they noticed how his body was laid. And then when they came to the tomb, they were the first ones to see the resurrection apart from the angels themselves and probably the Roman guards. But those Roman guards were under orders and then instructed how to lie. We can read about that in other places. So the ladies were the primary witnesses of his death, his burial, and his resurrection. Now, folks, if you study the culture in the day, the Jewish culture at the time, if you were going to create a lie, a hoax about the resurrection of Christ, the last thing you would do was have a set of females be your primary witness. They had no authority in court. They had no legal standing. You could not call them to refute or assert anything. The scribes and the Roman rulers, they had a plan. They executed that plan. They had all the legal authority. If a bunch of ladies would come up and say, well, we saw the tomb, it was empty, they wouldn't even be allowed to speak. This is the last thing you would do. This speaks to the authenticity of the testimony and the witness, and also the value that the Almighty places on the female gender. It is very high. Ladies were the last ones to see him buried alongside Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus. They were the first to see that empty tomb, except for the angels and the two Roman guards that would just happen to draw bad duty. They were in a bad place to be a Roman soldier. But the ladies were the first primary witness. It lends great authenticity to the testimony. Now, let's ask a question. This is a place of victory, and we all want to associate faith with victory. We have a tendency to want to do that. But let's check out the full story. What happened before this? Let's think a little bit about the days prior. You know, this is Sunday morning, very first thing Sunday morning, when Christ rose from the dead. Let's go back to Thursday night, the Garden of Gethsemane. Christ, this is right after the Passover, in the final few days of the life of Christ. He's under great duress. He goes to the Garden of Gethsemane to pray. His apostles, the 12 apostles, less Judas. Judas was at the Passover meal. He has already departed. He's in the process of betraying Christ. Christ is under great duress. He's separated himself by a space of a few feet to pray. Where are his followers? Asleep. They have no idea what's going on, no comprehension of what's happening. So here's the life of Christ. He's poured himself into the entire nation, the people around him for 3 years. The entire plan of salvation has been worked out. It depends on these 12 men. One of them is already shown to be a traitor to the point of betrayal. He wants his master murdered. Okay, so Christ is feeling that pressure. The entire plan is starting to unravel. It's starting to come apart. He's in the Garden of Gethsemane. Now what's about to happen? He gets betrayed. The entire nation of Israel turns on him, brands him as a heretic, and uses Roman rule and authority, and they agree with it, to crucify him. They trade out a murderer, Barabbas, for him. They crucify him between two thieves. Treat him as a complete loser, a complete heretic. He's beaten. He's in the most awful way, scourged, and then crucified, the most cruel form of death that mankind knows, one of the very worst ways to die. The Romans were masters in the use of power to control a population. They were probably the best the world has ever seen in terms of ironclad governance. They were known as the Empire of Iron the Kingdom of Iron for a reason. They knew how to do it and do it right. So here Christ, at the tail end of his ministry, everything has come apart. He's beaten, he's crucified, he's rejected, and it gets worse. The worst is yet to come. Let's go to Ephesians chapter 4. Let me take you there. Ephesians chapter 4, verses 7 through 10. Paul is writing here. He says, "But to each one of us grace is given, according to the measure of Christ's gift. Therefore it says, when he ascended on high, he led captive a host of captives, and he gave gifts to men." Now this expression, he ascended, what does it mean except that he also had descended into the lower parts of the earth? He who descended is himself also he who ascended far above all the heavens, that he might fill all things. Let's focus on that verse 9. Now this expression, he ascended, what does it mean except that he also had descended into the lower parts of the earth? That's a very curious phrasing that Paul uses there. You know, truckloads of theological ink have been spilled on this very passage, verse 9. It's interesting. Paul is a master of a language. He chooses his phrases very carefully. You know, there were some common ideas around death and the afterlife, borrowing from the Greeks, the Romans, and certainly the Hebrews, that Paul knew all about. Things called Sheol, death, the grave. Those things were all well known. Hades, very well known. Paul knew all of them very well and used them in other places in his writing. Notice he doesn't use any of those phrases here in verse 9. He says he also had descended into the lower parts of the earth. Why would he say lower parts of the earth? Why wouldn't he say Sheol or death or the grave or Hades? He would have been more specific. Well, as I say, theologians have debated that for millennia now, a very long time. But I want to give you a very straightforward reading of that. I like the simplest way to read it. He did not use those phrases because he did not want to get trapped into any of those ideas. He came up with a phrase of his own, lower parts of the earth, because he wants to convey an idea. And I would say that idea is this. He meant all of those things. What he meant was what happens to a person when they die, covered in sin, apart from God. What happens to them? They go to hell. Just a very straightforward reading of that. When he says he also had descended into the lower parts of the earth, Christ went to hell. At the end of that debacle, that unraveling of his plan of redemption, he faced death. And he faced it covered in sin, separated from God. Satan had won. Satan had won. He had won. He had the Son of God right where he wanted him in his stronghold. Paul calls it the lower parts of the earth. He does not want to dive off into any of the other meanings. It's not because he didn't know them. He knew them as well as anyone. He chose not to use them. He's creating an idea. What happens to a person separated from God, wrapped in sin, and when they die, they go to eternal damnation. Christ was there. He was in that place. Now, let's take a look at the very end of the life of Christ. Remember, we're exploring the idea, what does true faith do? What got Christ from Thursday night to Sunday morning? What carried him from that point? That point of when things were starting to unravel in the Garden of Gethsemane, they not only unraveled, it was a complete desolation of the plan of redemption that he had preached for 3 years. What got him to Sunday morning, to the resurrection? Let's take a hard look. Let's go to Matthew chapter 27. Now what you can do here, make use of the what's known as the synoptic gospel. Synoptic meaning same view. The first 3 gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, are written with basically the same information, just a little different detail. It gives you a full view. And then you have John, which is a separate accounting. But you put all 4 of those together, and you get a very clear and full, rich idea of the life of Christ and his ministry. We're going to look at the last 2 things he said. His last 2 statements. As he hung on the cross and he was passing on, there were 2 phrases that he made that are very instructive of us. And after that, that's when Ephesians 4 kicks in. Christ is in the stronghold of Satan. and then he is raised from the dead by the hand of God. Let's take a look at that. Matthew 27, let's read in verse 46. It came about the 9th hour, Jesus cried out. Now, Christ had been on the cross here for about 6 hours. He'd been hanging on the cross. He was crucified this would be about 3 p.m. He was crucified about 9 a.m. in the morning. So he'd been hanging on the cross about 6 hours. About the 9th hour, Jesus cried out with a loud voice, saying, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani, that is, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? Now, he's quoting from Psalms chapter 22. He quotes the opening line of that chapter. Psalms chapter 22, if you read the entire chapter, it's very instructive. It's a story of deliverance. The writer of that chapter is in a bad place, feeling completely abandoned, completely separated from God and everyone else. He's in a place of desolation and desperation. He cries out. And then over the course of that chapter, he is delivered by the hand of God. So Jesus chooses that chapter to quote as he's hanging there under great duress. Okay? Ele, Ele, lama sabachthani, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? Now that causes some stir among the people below him. It's interesting to note the two first words, Eli, Eli, he states in Aramaic, and he states in Hebrew, and he uses the personal form of God. It's like saying, Dad, why hast thou forsaken me? He quotes that in Hebrew, but then he switches to Aramaic and finishes the verse. Lama sabachthani. And that throws them off. Some say, is he calling for Elijah? Is Elijah going to save him? Let's wait and see. And some say he's delirious, and they bring him a painkiller, sour wine. And he actually takes it. It was offered to him by the Romans earlier. He turned it down. He takes this. They offer it to him in good faith, in goodwill. They want to ease his suffering. But he's actually being very strategic in his statements here. He quotes Psalms 22:1, and then that little shuffle takes place down below him. And then his last phrase, Luke chapter 23. Let's go to that passage. It'll be on your screen there. Luke 23:46. The last thing that Christ says, and Jesus, crying out with a loud voice, said, Father, into thy hands I commit my spirit. And having said this, he breathed his last. Now, we also have John 17, where he said, it is finished. That would be combined with this phrase in Luke 23. So he either said, it is finished, Father, into thy hands I commit my spirit, or Father, into thy hands I commit my spirit, it is finished. And he breathed his last. Those were his last words. Now, this came right after that statement, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani, my God, why have you forsaken me? You have a little shuffle down beneath him, and then, Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. Those were his last two statements, maybe 5-10 minutes apart. They were very close, and then he passed on. And then we see the lead into his resurrection. The last two things he said. Now let's be instructed. Here we have Christ who came to bring us the plan of redemption. That plan was in complete failure, completely fallen apart. The plan of the scribes, the Pharisees, the Jewish leaders, and the Roman leaders had succeeded. And that was actually the plan of Satan. Satan tempted Christ at the beginning of his ministry. He finally won. He got what he wanted. He had the Son of God and the Son of Man condemned as a criminal, rejected as a heretic, covered in sin, killed, buried, and in the stronghold of Satan. I would say in simple form, in hell. Now, Satan had won. You know, Satan is a clever guy, but he didn't think this one through. Because if he had, he would have never have hatched this plan. You see, when these things happened to Christ and he was in the stronghold of Satan, he was in the grave, covered in sin, here's the thing. It wasn't his sin. It was my sin. It was yours that covered him. And because of that, God reached down and raised him from the dead and took him to the right hand of the throne, and he sits there forevermore to give intercession for you and I. He is our high priest and the high priest of our faith. But let's be instructed about these last two statements. Let's read them again. Christ is hanging on the cross. He says, my God, why have you forsaken me? Ladies and gentlemen, that is a place of desperation. Have you ever been to a place of desperation? Are you there now? Understand, there is no place so low that you will ever be that God and Christ won't meet you right there. Christ has been there. Now, I want to comment on American faith for a bit. The faith of a follower of Christ as expressed in this modern American culture. You know, if we could choose the gospel that we wanted, it would be the prosperity gospel. That's the one we really like. You know, whom God loves, he makes rich. When you follow Christ, your problems are going to be solved. Money's going to come your way. Health is yours to claim. Victory all the time. That's a false gospel. It's not true. What was Christ's attitude about desperation? Was he ashamed of it? Did he run away from it? Did he reject it? Did he judge it? He embraced it. He took it as his own. He took it upon himself. My God, why have you forsaken me? Separation from God. He was rejected by his countrymen. He was let down by his followers. They were afraid of him, afraid of what was happening. They had no faith in him at that point. He was rejected by the governing authorities, the Roman government. God himself had to turn his back because of the sin of the world was upon him. My God, why have you forsaken me? And that's followed up. And what was Christ's response? When Christ was in that place of desperation, what was his next statement and last statement? Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. Trust. He said, God, I trust you. Then he passed on. He died. And he was in that place as Satan had in mind for him, covered in sin. It wasn't his sin. God raised him from the dead, and forevermore we declare the kingdom of Christ and our God. But we are called to walk in the faith that our Savior gave us. And we should, in this American culture, firmly reject the prosperity gospel. Ladies and gentlemen, go back to Matthew 27:46. My God, why have you forsaken me? That's the true gospel right there. That is the gospel of Christ. Not this get rich quick and claim anything you want. That's garbage. It's nonsense. This is the true gospel. And when we embrace that, we can touch anyone on this planet. We can talk to anyone. That is what faith does. That is how it lives. And it responds in times of desperation with trust. Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. That kind of faith, ladies and gentlemen, the bedrock of it, it's a choice. Rationality leads you to faith. Faith is a rational response to a rational question. That twin pillar of witness has been in front of every human since the beginning of time. It always will be. It is now. It will be until the end of time. It leads us to the question, who made all of this? Answer the question. Is it random or is it made? I say it's made. And I have the life of Christ now to inform me about how to live out this faith, what I do with it on a daily basis. Now, I want to call all of you to a choice. If you're a believer, as I said earlier, don't you dare doubt your faith ever again. Never again. You should have no doubt whatsoever, because sentiment has nothing to do with it whatsoever. At its core, it is a rational choice. Faith is a rational response to a rational question. For those of you that have been on the fence, you're not sure. Let me tell you something. You're not going to go anywhere that you don't face the witness and the testimony of the Almighty. And now we have on top of that the life of Christ. Every human has had the twin pillar of witness, and we have it today. God has worked with humanity through revelation, further revelation of his grace and his kingdom over time, and we have the life of Christ now. I encourage you The human heart is not an accident. This universe is not an accident. Some of you have not made that choice yet. I'm asking you, make it now. It is a rational choice. Faith is a rational response to a rational question. All the rationality, all the facts of life stand you right up in front of that question. Where did this come from? And on top of that, I encourage you to study the life of Christ. It's true, ladies and gentlemen. It's an historical fact, and that tomb is empty. Put your faith in it. It will change your life. Thank you so much. Thank you for being with me. God bless each of you.